Okay, perfect. We're going to go ahead and get started. So first of all, thank you all for joining us for this book launch and roundtable of Laura Field's Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. This beautiful book right here. I'm Aaron Irian. I'm an Institute Associate here at the Illiberalism Studies Program. I'm going to introduce our speakers in just a few moments, but first I want to make a couple of organizational notes. So how this is going to work is Laura's going to introduce the book for about 10 minutes. And then our speakers are going to offer some comments and questions, and then we'll open it up for lots of audience Q&A. You also may have noticed the stack of books near the entrance. So those are reserved for students who we appreciate being here. They are free and you can get them signed by Laura. So if you are a student at GW, go ahead and line up after the event and get your free signed book. So perfect. Laura Field, the author of this book, is a writer and political theorist in Washington, D.C., and a senior advisor here at the Illiberalism Studies Program. Matthew Dallek is a historian and professor of political management at GW, and his research and teaching interests include 20th century US politics, extremism, and the conservative movement. Elisabeth Anker is a professor of American Studies and Political Science at GW as well, and her research and teaching interests are at the intersection of political theory and cultural criticism, with a focus on expressions of freedom, violence, and power in US politics and culture. And finally, Tim Shenk is a historian of modern American politics and an assistant professor of modern US history at GW. And all of these lovely people up here are the authors of numerous books that you should also check out after this event. So perfect. With that, I will send it off to Laura.
There, is that better? Okay. All right. I think it's gonna. All right. Well, I'll just hold it here. Should I just stand? Yeah, I'll just stand. I think that'll be better. Turn this off. Okay, thanks. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you all here. I'm such a big fan of Marlene's program, the Illiberalism Studies Program here. And so thank you so much for having me. And thank you for buying all those books. It's really, really generous. So I'm going to say just a little bit about why I wrote the book, what I was trying to do with the book. And then I'll just give a little nuts and bolts account of the MAGA New Right so that everyone has a basic understanding of what I'm talking about in the book. So I wrote it because I was trained in, so maybe this is the why me question, why was I the one to write the book, and as well as why did we need a book like this? I was trained in conservative political philosophy circles of the Straussian variety. And I've never really been a conservative myself, but after 2016, I saw as the West Coast Straussians, sort of one cluster of the MAGA New Right, started defending Trumpism from an ideological perspective and sort of giving intellectual backing to Trump. And I was pretty alarmed by that. I was alarmed by the election of Trump in the first place and also alarmed by that. But I was someone who wasn't loyal to the conservative cause in any way, but also kind of spoke their language just because I studied the great books tradition with all these conservatives, and I have an attachment to that. And one of the surprising things that kept happening over the course of 2016 through 2024 was that they were using some of this rhetoric of the Western canon, the Western tradition, the good, the true, and the beautiful, right, to defend Trumpism. And so that became something that I was very curious about, and I wanted to do more public writing anyway, so I started writing about that. And then I actually wrote the book because after January 6th, I had assumed that this movement would kind of die off, that they would think, well, that didn't go so well. We ended up in a bad place. And that didn't happen. And so I was thinking about writing a different book about liberalism, and then it seemed like these people who I had already been writing about continued to have a lot of relevance. So I took on the project of writing a book, which I knew would sort of cover 2016 to 2024, the unfolding of this movement and its coalescence into something, that would have lasting impact in our politics. So that's why I wrote it. What I was trying to do with the book, I think three main things. First of all, I wanted there to be an explainer out there, right, that covered the basic moments of import of when these people came together. And I wanted there to be sort of profiles of some of the most important people available for just a general readership, so that people could become familiar with who was involved, who the main players were, what institutions they represented, how they did or didn't fit together intellectually, and so forth. And also just to unpack their ideas as best I could, right? And criticize them in some cases. But I wanted there to be an account of that available. I also wanted to convey sort of the second thing I was trying to do with the book was to convey a sense of the allure of some of this stuff. So threaded in the book, I mean, I'm obviously not a fan of a lot of it. I'm pretty straightforward about that. I'm upfront about where I'm coming from in the book, but I do think that there's a lot about some of these people and some of what they're trying to accomplish that is going to be deeply attractive and has been deeply attractive. And there are reasons why people are drawn to it, why young men are drawn to it, in particular, why why this has happened. So I wanted to try to give some voice to that in the course of the book. And then finally, I just wanted to convey a sense of urgency. I think that what's going on in these intellectual circles is quite a bit more radical than ordinary voters are aware of or ready to support. And so I tried to do that with the book too. Okay, so when I talk about the MAGA New Right, I'm basically describing the intellectual coalition that has gathered behind Trump and Trumpism, the new conservative brain trust that's guiding the GOP. There are, of course, significant precursors to this movement, and none of it has happened in a vacuum. But in the give of the take of the party, I think that we've seen that between 2016 and 2024, there's been a dramatic shift and an ideological radicalization that has happened. So the old guard, the Reagan Buckley types, the neocons, and what they call the old establishment has given way. They've been jettisoned basically and radicalized, and the MAGA new right types have taken over. And so we're talking about the people who are responsible for Project 2025. JD Vance is obviously the kind of culminating point of this movement in some ways so far. But also when we see the Nazi jokes in the chat group, the threads that keep getting leaked, that's part of what we're talking about. Or if you saw the Mehdi Hassan dialogue with the 20 or so young right young people, a lot of them, I could see very distinct threads of what I was writing about popping up in that discourse. And then, of course, right now we're seeing this blowing up at the Heritage Foundation and this big dispute between Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes. My book doesn't really talk about Nick Fuentes much, but it does talk about Tucker Carlson, but I kind of limit myself to people either with PhDs. I had to, the MAGA world is very big, right? So I had to kind of parse my way through this. So people with PhDs who were important to the movement, or people who were otherwise just really important at key moments in the movement, like Sohrab Ahmari and some of the other people I'll mention. So the movement unfolded between 2016 and 2024. It was consolidated further after January 6th. And it was theorized when we see these things blow up between Tucker and Nick Fuentes or Kevin Roberts at the Heritage Foundation. They've been thinking about whether these boundaries, the supposed boundaries and firewalls between the far right and the right, whether those would go down or how much they would accept the hard right figures. And they had slogans to describe their willingness to break down those barriers, things like no enemies to the right, or the Claremont Institute talks about knowing what time it is and whether or not you're sufficiently radical or counter-revolutionary. So they theorized this, they did debate it internally, and mostly time and time again, they didn't sustain those old barriers, which I know were porous, if you all know what I'm talking about, but the barrier, right, the Buckley types would try to keep out the far right anti-Semites, especially, and racists from the movement, and that has more or less gone away, except for right now there's this extreme anti-Semitism, very explicit, and that's causing some uproar right now on the right. Okay, so just that's kind of the big overview. What do these different people stand for? Formulaically, you can think of the establishment conservatism or the sort of Reagan-Buckley conservatism as committed to neoliberal economics. This is the old classical kind of fusionist account of American conservatism. Classical liberal economics, so free trade, globalism, plus social conservatism or social traditionalism. And then that fused with anti-communism abroad, right? And a kind of liberal internationalism, or that then flipped into neoconservatism. So we could debate what all of those things mean. But that's the kind of classic stool of the Reagan stool. And in 2016, Michael Anton, who is with a fellow with the Claremont Institute, this was before Trump was even elected, he offered a new definition of sort of a new rallying point, or it was a new definition of Trumpism. And he said, Trumpism is economic nationalism, closed borders or secure borders, and America first foreign policy. So it's a very distinctive and different formula for what Trumpism does represent and what conservatism should represent. And it's hearkening back to old sort of what we call the old right, and other precursors like Goldwaterism, Pat Buchanan, and paleoconservatism. And there's certainly the old social traditionalism is also still part of this new formula. So I say that it's a four-legged stool instead of a three-legged stool. But you can see a turn towards isolationism, and obviously the nationalist economics that Trump is so fond of. I think it can be summed up as a rejection of the universalist, rights-based liberal order and internationalism, and its replacement with nativist populism. So that's the sort of brief version of it. I think we've got an hour and a half, so I'm gonna say a little bit about the different groups and cohorts that I talk about, just so that we have some terms to work with as we continue with the discussion. I divide the new right into three basic camps, and each of them is sort of oriented towards in their own direction, towards a distinctive telos or purpose, and the different visions of the different cohorts are obviously sometimes in tension. So we have first the Claremonters, who I've mentioned already. Michael Anton and John Eastman are some familiar names here. Larry Arnn of Hillsdale College is important. They were inspired by Harry Jaffa and the Claremont Institute in California, and they are oriented towards preserving the virtuous order of the American founding, as they and only they understand it. Their view is radicalized away from, I think, this Jaffa-esque vision in two ways. They generally hold that we have departed so far today from the original Republican vision that counter-revolutionary actions are warranted. And they have taken also a decisively nativist or paleoconservative turn, and sometimes quite explicitly. So if we get in the weeds here, Michael Anton has called himself a paleo-Straussian, which I think to Harry Jaffa would have been a contradiction in terms. The Claremonters have a slogan or a catchphrase, which, as I've mentioned, is knowing what time it is, and they warn that the hour is late. Next up, we have the post-liberals, and that includes some Catholic integralists, though not all post-liberals are, no, all Catholic integralists are post-liberals, but I'd say not all post-liberals are Catholic integralists, and we can certainly talk more about that. They include people like Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, Gladden Papin, Sohrab Ahmari, and they ultimately, I think, want to usurp and commandeer the modern American state and redirect it towards a traditional social order, more communitarian, and towards conservative Catholic ends as they understand them. The goal here is described variously as, spiritual salvation, the highest good, or simply the common good, right? Adrian Vermeule has written this book called The Common Good Constitutionalism, which is meant to be a replacement to originalist jurisprudence and organized towards a very thick, substantive view of the good. J.D. Vance situates himself within this post-liberal, most closely within the post-liberal faction, though he's got his fingers basically in every pot of the new right that you can think of. Third, we have the NatCons, or National Conservatives, who are led by Yoram Hazony. And this is basically the big umbrella or organization for the new right. And it's pretty capacious, a big tent organization. The NatCons basically line up behind hardcore capital N nationalism. Yoram Hazony wrote a book in 2018 that aimed to restore nationalism as a rallying point for the right. They want closed borders and basically a pretty homogenous Christian American nation, and hold that the nation-state system is the foundation of good politics. So there's Hazoni has lots of room for diversity among nations, but not much room for diversity or pluralism within the nation state. And then finally, there's a fourth group that spans the other three that I just call the hard right, where we find people like Bronze Age pervert, Curtis Yarvin, raw egg nationalist, Stephen Wolfe, some other interesting characters. Ideologically, they all have their own sort of special takes and worldviews, and they span the other three. But some of these are open about their fascism. They use dehumanizing rhetoric and are more openly violent in their rhetoric also. So that's my basic schema. There are also the tech billionaires who pop up here and there in the book. And that's maybe something we can talk about where they exactly fit. Some of that took me by surprise. And I think a few of them are sort of true new right believers, and others are just opportunists who are going to go wherever the power is. So that's my basic conception of the different camps, the overall shift. There's a lot to talk about, which I'm sure we'll get into. We can talk about why they're so angry. The book is called Furious Minds. I've sort of talked about the minds part, right? The ideological breakdown, but we could talk about what happened here. And then also, of course, how it all fits together. What matters more, the unifying threads or the disagreements? To what extent do these conflicts and schisms actually matter? They aren't one homogenous group. And so, how much does it matter that Patrick Deneen's vision of the common good is completely at odds with the Lincolnian vision of Harry Jaffa, or the tech CEO, fantasies of Curtis Yarvin? I think those are very interesting questions. It's very complicated. Generally, I think we are at risk of overstating the divisions and not. I think the schism that matters most is the schism between the new right in general and the American people. I mean, that's my hunch. I think that a lot of the tensions, there's a big tension between the sort of deconstruct the administrative state people and then the harness the state and use it towards their own ends. There's kind of a theoretical tension there that I don't know how much it matters in practice, because they'll keep the parts of the state they want and presumably use it for their own ends. Here's just one final sentence. I'm going to conclude with a little line from Christopher Rufo's manifesto for the New Right. He wrote that this is part, what is to be done. He says, the activist must begin with status quo reality. The institutions which shape public and private life will exist for the foreseeable future. The only question is who will lead them and by which set of values. The new right must summon the self-confidence to say, we will, and by our values. So that's, I think, the general mood, and I'll leave it at that.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So should I just start? Let me see if everyone can hear me. Can people hear me? Stand up. All right. I'll come over here. Okay. Can people hear me now? Wait. Turn that off. Furious Minds. I'm going to leave this on. It's like I'm bejeweled. Okay. Furious Minds takes the intellectual trajectory of the MAGA right seriously. On its own, I think this is incredibly important, right? It's really common for critics, everyone from the far left to the moderate right, to denounce the MAGA movement and the far right generally for its anti-intellectualism, for its childish Groyper aesthetics, for social media missives that often might not spell words right or communicate in basic English, right? But Field insists that we would not just be wrong, but negligent to make either the presumption that the far right and the MAGA new right in general is a non-intellectual, visceral movement, or to presume that our own claims to intellectual superiority would be the best way to challenge it. Furious Minds carefully unpacks the intellectual trajectory of the MAGA movement, helpfully parsing out its different angles and different factions, while also showing the surprising ease of their connections, right? We learn how post-liberal Catholic traditionalists align with tech bros with God complexes, right? Or with how the January 6th rioters get sympathetic reception in staid think tanks, or how Nazis find common ground with nationalists, right? If any book can help us understand the internal discussions just this weekend within the Republican Party about whether to mainstream Nazi influencers, right? This is that book. There's so much to say about this fantastic and important book, but I will just pick out 3 points and then I'll end with a question. The first is, as somebody who is also trained in political theory, like Laura and like many of the people in this book, one of the most surprising parts of this book is how so much of the framework for the new right comes from political theory, especially a particular tradition, right, as Laura mentions, called Straussianism, which is about close reading of canonical texts, especially ancient texts, in order to find esoteric meanings in them, and oftentimes the presumption that those meanings are only available to people who are intellectually superior. I think political theorists in general need to reckon with the way in which their texts and methods can so smoothly support violent and reactionary politics. Right? These ideas are not only powerful within the academy, where you might imagine they would remain, but they've also won deep financial backing from wealthy far-right benefactors. And so we can see the ways in which ideas and money intertwine to create so much of the right-wing ecosphere far beyond the academy, but I think that really culturates a broader movement and is part of the ways in which some of these more esoteric ideas come to shape a kind of political ethos more broadly. Right? Political theorists formed the ideas behind January 6th and Stop the Steal. They were the vanguard for normalizing Trump's authoritarianism, and their visions helped to cultivate the new religious dominionism. I think the discipline needs to reckon with this more fully, especially, as Field notes, because the intellectuals behind these movements are often more radicalized than the general population. Right? This was shocking to me, right? And I think it's important for us to think about, why is it so? Why are the academics and the knowledge producers more radicalized to the far right than average Americans, including Americans who might otherwise support MAGA politics? So I'd like to know more at some point from Laura about, like, why are we finding the most radical forms in some of these small corners of academia, think tanks, and things like that. My second point, one of the most innovative and refreshing parts of this book, which it is actually, given the dense and also, kind of emotionally challenging material, and like a beautiful and easily digestible read. Right? And I think one of the most important ways in which this happens is because Field weaves her own personal stories of her intellectual development and her lived experiences into the argument. And this is stunning for a few reasons. One, it's rare to see a book about intellectual history and ideas that makes personal experience also central to the story, right? Two, Laura's personal story does really important political work in the book. To my mind, when she writes about meeting people, sitting at dinners, attending their conferences, it reminds us that the people that she's looking at are real human beings with real ideas that have developed over time. And they've done so in many of the same circles in which Laura had her own political and intellectual development. Right? And indeed, as Laura noted earlier, some of her impetus for the book comes out of those experiences. Yet I think Laura is showing us something important and different by weaving in her own story, right? By being trained to think in many of the same ways as the MAGA New Right, she takes a different path, right? And on the one hand, she insists that we center the experiences of just ordinary people like her, right? Rather than the centering, what we also often see in part of the MAGA New Right, of these deep abstractions about Western civilization, for instance, or abstractions about the good or the just or the true, right? Rather than, what ordinary people experience every day as they navigate life, right? Laura also insists on the absolute value of women as scholars and political actors in the way that almost universally across the New Right is both refused and rejected. And last, Laura reminds us that ideas are always about the people who interpret them. And none of these people ever have a last say on the text they interpret. That including us, like none of us have the last say on the text we interpret. But people also don't have a last say on the world we are living in that so many in the MAGA New Right condemn, or they do not have the final say in the politics they try to dominate. Right? Trained in a similar fashion, Laura offers a really different way of living political ideas. The last thing I'll say, or the last comment before my larger question, is that Furious Minds shows us that one of the most consistent ideas across every corner of the new right is misogyny. This distinguishes the new right from earlier versions of conservatism, which still emphasized, right, what people often invest in are kind of traditional values, ones that might come out of a sort of patriarchal worldview that frequently demanded women to be the voice of a morality that was circumscribed within the home sphere, where they are putatively more, suited to raising children than to the rough and tumble of politics or scholarship. What we see now is not just a return to these patriarchal values, but actually a celebration of misogynistic violence against women, of a denigration of women as thinkers and as citizens, and oftentimes of really brutal forms of gender control. This rank misogyny might seem obvious, but I think it is still overlooked in a lot of the analysis of the far right. We focus very importantly and concretely on forms of racism and white supremacy, but I think less so on just like kind of violent misogyny that circulates. And I'll give an example, right? Um, in the recent coverage of the leaked text chain of the Young Republicans, right, most Americans were horrified by the vile anti Semitism and the racist invective that was also pulled out by other politicians, by pundits, and by media who noticed that. And all of that was certainly there, right? But what was the most prevalent theme across the text chain's thousands of messages was just repeated misogyny, right? The Young Republicans were constantly trashing women, gleefully talking about sexual domination in many of the texts. And it's really telling not only how misogynistic these texts were, but also that this was barely mentioned in the media or popular punditry, right? Perhaps it's become so normalized or is just not seen as much of a problem that it went under the radar more than some of the more vile and vocalized, moments of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. So, Laura insists that we recognize misogyny at the center of the new right. And in fact, it seems to be one of the strongest glues holding this somewhat messy coalition together. And I wonder why, like, what is it about misogyny that is gaining such a strong holding power now? And this leads me to my question, which is, um, if these ideas have a very long lineage, right, that Laura traces and that we also see in work by my co-panelists, Matt Dallek and Tim Shenk. And I wonder why these ideas are becoming so much more successful and so radicalized at this moment, right? Like why in 2016 to 2024 have these ideas become so much more compelling and so much more violent at the same time? Why have they gained popularity as they develop in more violent and authoritarian ways? Right? Many of the ideas of the new right when they first came out were considered extreme and fringe, even in their more sanguine form of Barry Goldwater republicanism. And I wonder, why did they gain such a foothold now? And why is this anger so strong now? Right? I have my own thoughts from some of my own work that I will postulate, but I really would like to hear what if Laura thinks this is correct or why. Right? I think it has something to do with the larger political economic conditions Americans face right now in the ruins of neoliberal globalization, of state defunding, and of national decline. Many Americans feel trapped in a world where they have significantly less agency than they expected to have a generation ago. And people want to both feel powerful again, both politically and economically, and also to feel that they can push back against the forces that they feel disempower them. Those in the far right in particular, because this is something that affects people across the political spectrum. But I think those in the far right want to recoup their power in part through forms of domination, of dominating other people, viewing more vulnerable people, people who might have had less access to political power in the past, women, people of color, immigrants, viewing them either as objects to command or as obstructions to their own power. It's as if their agency only matters when they achieve supremacy over other people, and indeed supremacy over democracy itself, right? Dominating the will of the people, dominating over the pluralism that is at the heart of the American project, right? I think these ideas are especially compelling for white men from wealthier classes because they are the citizens who were historically positioned as most suited for ruling over others and who are almost pretty universally make up the MAGA rights intellectuals. Right? Most people in the US feel under threat from an array of new political, geopolitical, and economic forces. But traditional holders of power might also feel under threat from the rise of social movements, especially in this decade of 2016 onward, right? Movements that really have changed public life over the last decade, which granted power to people who have been historically targeted as lower in status hierarchies or as less deserving of power, right? The Me Too movement against sexual assault and for gender equality in workplaces, the Black Lives Matter movement for racial justice in 2020, the rise of trans rights, the rise of Muslim and Jewish politicians and in positions of leadership, the revival of labor union power, the kind of pushback against COVID in the attempts of government mandates to stay home to protect immunocompromised people, the elderly and children. And also young workers' insistence across industries that their companies have to support social change or movements, right, for environmental social governance, as Laura writes about. So amidst this stew of changes in the 2010s, from government flailing to global financialization to progressive social movements, people who felt disempowered by all three are fighting back by reclaiming their power of mastery in a way that I think harnesses all of the different factions of the MAGA New Right. The intellectuals of the MAGA New Right offer blueprints for how to reclaim this power. And that is at least my guess as to why they have become so popular now and also why they push back so much against democracy. But even more, I would love to hear what Laura thinks. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this book. It's fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me okay? Yes. All right. Thank you so much for having me on the panel. It's great to be on with everyone. I agree with everything that Professor Anker said. I mean, it's a wonderful book. I learned so much, and I encourage all of you to read it. I just have 4 brief issues, some of which have been touched upon, but 4 brief issues that occurred to me as I was reading it that I thought were particularly striking, although there are certainly others. They concern the periodization of this history, 2016 to 2024, the question of how much power these intellectuals exert, the issue of extremism and radicalization, which I found fascinating, and then also the movement's internal politics, which I know Laura touched on as well. So first, the notion of MAGA as a new intellectual force, I found really fascinating as I was reading it. And I think I would just like to hear more. Maybe we could talk about why it is fundamentally a departure from these kind of older versions of conservatism that you were mentioning. And the reason it occurs to me is that I remember, I think, assigning in a course Robert Bork's Slouching from Gomorrah, which I think appeared in the 90s, but he was the former Supreme Court nominee. And I haven't read that book in a long time, but there are certain elements in there, and he certainly was very high profile, that would resonate now, probably with some of these thinkers. And so how would that differ from someone like Bronze Age pervert in our own times, right? A second kind of question and point. So as I read this terrific book, I kept coming back to this chicken or the egg question. And I wondered if Trump's victories, especially in 2016, but the whole arc of the last decade, if Trump's victories empowered and inspired and mobilized the intellectual wing of the MAGA New Right. It inspired them to start new magazines, publish their books, creating this kind of intellectual fervor and ferment that would not have existed otherwise, and empowered them to bring their ideas to more wider audiences. Or alternatively, were these thinkers important in creating a kind of ideological seedbed that ultimately enabled Trumpism to flourish? I mean, I find it so interesting that in these tech chains among these Republican operatives, some of the language and ideas is resonating with the thinkers that you're writing about. So it suggests that some of the language that they're filtering down right into the culture. And so thinking about like how much impact, especially in the age of social media, do these intellectuals have on not just our politics, but our culture and our lives. A third theme I just wanted to briefly flag is within, so the book really focuses on this 2016 to 2024 period, but where does MAGA's intellectual wing stand at the beginning, right, when Trump first runs, and where is it now? Because before the 2016 election, Michael Anton, who Laura mentioned, published this famous essay, Flight 93, in which he described the prospect of a Hillary Clinton victory as basically the death knell of the United States. And it was about as apocalyptic as you can get. And that makes me wonder whether over this period, over the past decade, these MAGA New Right intellectuals were more or less static in their extremism, that they were pretty radical from the start, or did they kind of start out radical but become even more extremist over the past decade? Even ironically, as their ideas maybe became more more mainstream, excuse me. So in other words, as Trump tightened his grip on the Republican Party, as election denialism and January 6th became a kind of litmus test for conservatives, and as Trump's 2024 popular vote victory and his return to the White House elated his supporters, how did the conspiracism, the white supremacy, the misogyny that Libby mentioned, how did it deepen and intensify? And did these radicals end up in a place where they were not even, say, 9 years ago? And then last, I wondered, and again, this is something, Laura, that you mentioned, but I thought it was a fascinating theme in the book. And actually, I think it has implications for the road ahead for our politics, which is, I wondered whether the MAGA New Right was a cohesive ideological movement, or it was so beset by internal disagreements that it is going to be hard to sustain once Trump has left the scene. So Laura mentioned that some of the different groups, right, that the book introduces us to. And the question is, do they share a common worldview, right? The ideas that each of these groups, the Claremonters, the post-liberals, the national conservatives, Christian nationalists, are those ideas enough of a glue, whether it's maybe misogyny as well, right, to keep the movement together, to kind of create the ideological ballast that will keep it unified going forward? And I ask that as well because some of the characters in the books do seem more fixated on, let's say, race and immigration. Others are focused on the perceived threat of women's empowerment. Others envision a Christian nation. These are not necessarily in conflict, but there are different emphases. And I think, again, the question feels more immediate as I watch this kind of uproar over Tucker Carlson's friendly interview with the white supremacist Nick Fuentes. I'm just going to end with a very brief point. So I keep hearing, especially over the past 10, 11 months, a lot of reporters and pundits who describe Trump primarily as a transactional president, right? Above all else. He is, they say, he's a deal maker, and he hardly has any convictions. And I just want to echo, I think, something Libby said, which is what I appreciate and value about Laura's book, is how it pulls back the curtain on just how deeply ideological the MAGA movement has always been and how central ideas are to its successes. Your book demonstrates how Trump's agenda is informed and inspired by thinkers and intellectual currents and combatants who use philosophy and ideas to justify an attempt to remake, I think, the country, to bring some of the values back to, Laura, what you were describing earlier as kind of a pre-New Deal, right? Almost 1920s paleo-conservative era. So I really appreciate and thank you for helping to put the MAGA movement in a fuller light. And I think it's really an important contribution. And thank you also for having me on the panel.
Right. I want to pick up exactly where Matt left off with thanks. So thanks to Laura for writing this fantastic book. Thanks to the Illiberalism Studies Program for bringing us all together for this conversation. I mean, if nothing else, I just got to hear Matt Dallek say the phrase Bronze Age pervert in a room of, I don't know, 70 people.
Practice.
Thank you, made my day. So thank you for that. All right. So what I want to do for the short time I'll be up here today is talk about, well, Laura's book mostly, but through the lens of what's been called the most important story in American politics right now, the crackup of the American right. I think that's an interesting comment, and especially interesting given the person who said it, which is Ben Shapiro last week in the wake of the Tucker Carlson imbroglio. All right, now my background here for this is not terribly relevant that you guys need to know, but I am in a phase of writing that Laura was probably in not too long ago, the boring last minute polishing up the footnotes stage of writing a book. And that is a book where your brain can be on autopilot for a good chunk of the time, which means I had an opportunity last week to listen to the entirety, the 2 hour and 23-minute entirety of Tucker Carlson's conversation with Nick Fuentes. My wife is sick of hearing me talk about this, but she is not here today and you all are. So buckle up. We're going to have a conversation about the long history of the American right, its connection to Laura's book through the lens of Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, and what I put myself through last week. All right, and there are 3 main points I want to make and questions I want to ask for Laura. And because I'm a child, I think in terms of alliteration. So this is about continuity, coherence, and complementarity. Continuity of the American right across, let's say, the long history of what Daniel Schlossman and Sam Roosevelt have called the long new right, roughly Bill buckling the founding of the National Review, 1950s, down to the present. So how much is the MAGA new right a break from what came before? Then coherence, picking up again where Matt left off. How much coherence is there within the MAGA movement? And then complementarity. This maybe connects to a point that Libby was mentioning earlier, but I'm going to put my own spin on it. Why now? Why is the MAGA right? Why is this particular intellectual constellation gaining force right now? And in particular, can we get a good answer to that question, not just by situating it within the history of the American right, but thinking about the American left and American politics generally at the same time? How much has the left been transformed during the same period? And has it been transformed in a way that, if not an exact replica, is maybe a mirror image or a photo negative of what's been going on the right? One inspiration for this is thinking about, God damn, this is a great title. Various Minds. It's a great title for what's happening on the right, but I was thinking it's such a good title that you could use it to talk about American intellectual history since 2014, 2016 generally. There's a lot of anger to go around here. Certainly, maybe a disproportionate share on the right, but a good amount on the left as well. But let's begin. Furious Minds, the making part. Now, I will confess, I am far from a Nick Fuentes scholar. Thank God, that is not how I spend my time. So my familiarity with the Nick Fuentes oeuvre is confined basically entirely to this interview with Tucker Carlson. But I had at least a passing familiarity of this dude beforehand. The guy who was a neo-Nazi, a white supremacist, somehow talked his way into having, sorry, can you hear me in the back? All right, lean in. So someone who had somehow managed to talk his way into dinner with Donald Trump and Kanye West in 22. All right, and the impression I got was that Nick Fuentes was basically an expression of the uncontrolled id of a certain type of extremely online neo-Nazi, someone who was high on feelings and low on intellectual substance. All right. So one thing I was surprised about was that wasn't exactly the Fuentes who showed up to this conversation with Carlson. One thing he did, which I was, again, surprised to see, was display a decent amount of familiarity with the longer history of the American right. So it wasn't just a parade of idness for 2 hours and 23 minutes. There definitely was that to a degree. But he situated himself in a longer tradition that in his telling stretched back to Pat Buchanan in the 90s. And not just Pat Buchanan, who is maybe a pretty obvious reference point at this stage of the game, but to more obscure thinkers like Sam Francis, a character who Laura discusses in this, again, fantastic book, who was one of Buchanan's main intellectual advisors, and to the longer history of the America First movement, a term that came up again and again in his conversation with Carlson, a point of agreement between the two of them. They both agreed that they were part of this thing, an American First movement, or at least they could be. And they were well aware that the history of the movement stretched back to before the founding of modern conservatism, to before National Review. And of course, worth noting in this context when we think about continuity across a long history of the American right, that as Sam Tannenhouse reminds us in his fantastic biography of Bill Buckley that came out over the summer, that a young Bill Buckley was thrilled to be at Madison Square Garden cheering along to Charles Lindbergh and the rest of the original America First movement in 1940. So when we think about continuity across the longer history of the American right, I take the point that there's a rupture from Reaganism, and especially the orthodox version of Reaganism that had calcified by, let's say, 2012 to 2016. That was based on a story about the American conservative movement that could have pointed from the founding of National Review to the primary nomination of Barry Goldwater, to Ronald Reagan's presidency, to maybe a Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan presidency, if that had gone differently. And in failing that, to a Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz story. So from one perspective, of course, the MAGA right is a break from the vision of the Republican Party and the conservative movement that a lot of conservative elites had in DC in 2016. But I wonder, with that longer story of America First and the career of someone like Pat Buchanan, of course, who begins his career as an advisor to Richard Nixon, who's in the Reagan administration, and who is published frequently in journals like National Review, how much continuity there is across the long run. All right, so that's my first question for Laura, just thinking more about continuity across the history of the American right. Then coherence. So not how does the MAGA right fit in the history of American conservatism, but what is the MAGA right now as an intellectual project? And then, again, going back to the Fuentes interview, something that was striking to me. So the subject, it was largely a friendly interview, a congenial one. Most of the questions were puff pieces, but to the extent that there was a disagreement, one of perhaps the signal disagreement between them, although it was gently expressed, was Carlson chastising Fuentes for his position on identity politics. It was Carlson saying that what you are doing, Nick, is identity politics, and that is a thing that as a Christian, he says that he could not abide. He said because his Christian belief told him that there was no such thing as blood guilt, that you are all judged as individuals. And he said that he opposed white identity politics for the same reason that he opposed Black Lives Matter for the same reason that he opposed what Israel's been doing in Gaza. So thinking about one, that clash between Carlson, which might have been more rhetorical than substantive, might have been for strategic purposes in order to maintain at least some plausible deniability, despite the fact that he was platforming Fuentes. But nonetheless, if you were just reading a transcript, you would think that these guys really disagreed about this thing. You would also find a kind of mellow agreement on economics, populist economics. This picks up on another aspect of the sort of Trumpian MAGA intellectual project. So it seemed as if I were going to interpret why Carlson had Fuentes on the show, one explanation could be that he wanted to recruit him into his vision of a post-Trumpian right. This idea that Trump is already off the stage. So what's really going on is an argument about the future of the Republican Party, the future of conservatism. And it's clear if you read Tucker Carlson's work, which I have spent a decent amount of time doing, that two core principles that have been guiding him, bracketing the question of identity just for the moment, anti-interventionist foreign policy and some kind of economic protectionism. You see Carlson in Furious Mind attending these dorky, wonky MAGA conferences where he's delivering talks on with titles like, what is it? Why big business is bad for the family? Something to that effect. He's been thinking about these questions for a while. And Carlson seems to see Trump leaving the stage as an opportunity to bring someone like Fuentes on board with a kind of economic populist or nationalist project. And Fuentes didn't seem to object to that all that much. And the place where they strongly agreed, foreign policy. So not just anti-interventionist foreign policy, but crucially Israel. Foreign policy isn't a subject that takes up a lot of attention, I think it's fair to say, in this book, but I'd love to hear Laura talk more about that. And in this time when I was working on the footnotes, because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment, I did not just listen to the Fuentes Carlson discussion, listen to a lot of the conversation around it. Someone like Dave Smith, another MAGA friendly podcast host who had Carlson on afterward, and used what to me was a very striking phrase, genocide in 4K, to describe what's been going on in Gaza, which seemed, Dave Smith, notable in this context, is also Jewish, but seemed as if if we're looking for continuity across this wing of the MAGA right, that yes, again, race identity is easy to point to, but it seems to me like they're sincere. Even someone like Candace Owens, sincere when they're talking about their opposition to what's going on in Gaza right now. Similarly, if you look at their opponents on the other side, Ben Shapiro, Commentary Magazine, the more hawkish wing or more establishmentarian wing of the Heritage Foundation, whose struggle session last week I listened to in almost all of its entirety. God, I really need to finish these footnotes. Maybe we'll go faster if I just listen to this. That is striking the degree to which this debate within the right is taking place along two tracks. If you listen to Ben Shapiro, if you listen to Commentary, if you listen to older folks at the Heritage Foundation, this is about white supremacy. This is about a neo-Nazi. If you listen to Tucker Carlson, the way he at least is framing it, it's about this battle over the future of the MAGA movement, what happens after Trump, where anti-interventionist foreign policy and economic populism, perhaps not coincidentally, something that older establishment types at Heritage, Ben Shapiro, folks at Commentary, they are opposed on Israel, they are opposed on economic protectionism, and they are opposed on platforming Nick Fuentes. So the difficulty of disentangling these two, something, again, I hope that Laura can help us think through, and what this says about the future of the movement. All right, last point, very last point, complementarity. So in his justification, both in the interview and after, for why he invited Fuentes on the show, Carlson said that one of the most important reasons is that he decided that Nick Fuentes cannot be canceled. Many people have tried over the years. And he said that Fuentes has only become stronger. So strong that on Rumble, a site, I will confess, it's sort of a right-wing-ish, or at least an alternative to YouTube, a website I had never heard of before this interview. Turns out that Nick Fuentes has 5 million followers on there, that he has more regular listeners than almost any host of equivalent position on the left. Interesting. And that his audience is seems to overwhelmingly consist of young men, disproportionately, but not exclusively, young white men. All right. What Carlson said is that he is convinced that Fuentes is the future. Maybe not entirely Fuentes himself. You can see the conversation as part of an attempt to bring a moderated version of Fuentes into this coalition, but this is a force to be reckoned with. So the question is why? And here we're going to get into potentially tricky sub-territory because I'm going to give Nick Fuentes a compliment. One part of this conversation where I felt he was being truly perceptive was in his discussion, not of politics, but of culture, specifically the culture that the internet is making, and specifically its effect on the young men who form up his audience, because this guy is nothing if not a shrewd analyst, a shrewd interpreter of his own popularity. What does he say? He says the internet is a machine for generating isolation, alienation, and anger, and that he is someone who speaks to it. And I couldn't help thinking about the contrast between the kind of joie de vivre that he brings to making his case, contrasting that with the fustiness of Heritage Foundation senior fellows lecturing the younger staffers about how they need to grow up and they need to familiarize themselves with the history of the movement. They need to understand that World War II was important, Churchill was good, Hitler was bad. And have you heard of this fellow, Bill Buckley? He kicked the Birchers out of the movement. That's what we have to do right now. It makes me wonder if Carlson is right, that someone like Fuentes is the future of the conservative movement. And it makes me wonder if the same culture that the internet makes, if it's conducive to a certain type of politics, a politics that has created its own types of furious minds on the left. Thinking too about symmetries between right and left rather than differences. I'm reminded of the fact that, totally take Libby's point, that the policies, the worldview of the MAGA new right, much more extreme than the views of the typical normie Republican. Then again, the policies and the worldview of the academic intellectual left, also not in terms of challenging democracy necessarily, but just in terms of substance, much more extreme in academia among the intellectual left than among the normies of the Democratic Party, which is why, much to my chagrin, Joe Biden beat Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in 2020. So, thinking then about the sort of structural divergence between the ideas generating machines of both the left and the right, and about the pressures created by social media and the rest of internet politics that we're also familiar with. Laura's book, it tells us the history. It's a work of contemporary history about the making of this thing, the MAGA New Right. In closing, I just want to ask, whatever this thing is, the divergences within the movement, is it the thing that we're going to be stuck with for the long haul?
Perfect, Laura. So if you want to respond to some of those questions that everyone has asked you, you will have to use the lapel mics
Yeah.
that we've given. And then after that, we'll go to audience Q&A for the next 30, 35 minutes or so.
All right, can you hear me now? All right. Those are all the questions I thought I had avoided really carefully in the book and sort of danced my way around. But I'm going to kind of go backwards and you can just remind me if I'm totally missing something. Tim. Let me think for a second. So I didn't watch the Fuentes video yet because I've been busy with other stuff. I've never really watched a full one, but I've sort of thought about it enough and sort of read the brief accounts. And I think Fuentes doesn't come up in my book just because he's so far gone and sort of part of the deep underground gutter. But that doesn't mean he's not super powerful, right? And I don't know if he's the future of the movement. I think it's still worth trying to do some gatekeeping. But I'm pretty fusty myself, right? I mean, this book is not the future of the conservative movement. It's not a very online. I mean, I did watch a lot of this unfold online. I tried to not be totally bookish in my whole approach to the thing, but it's really difficult because I basically argue that though there is all of the, you're the historian, right? And so you both of you, right? And Libby, you're a theorist. So, but you two know this history in a way that I tried to kind of, not finesse. I had to learn a lot about the history so that I knew what I was talking about. But the continuities with the past are sort of, I think, glaring to a historian in a way that they aren't sort of to the ordinary person. And so I had to kind of reveal some of that. Who the ordinary person who's just sort of buys into the Buckley orthodoxy. And so I had to kind of show some of that while also making the case that this is quite different. And I say it's different in three ways that kind of bring us back to some of what you just said. I say it's different for the misogyny, for the tech, the media, social media savvy, which sort of captures what you just mentioned, which is the sort of hyper online character of this, the new virality of all of it, the kind of constant outrage that we all know is there. And so that seems very strikingly different, but the book is not about social, like that kind of thing, because I'm not equipped as a historian to talk about all of this history, and I'm not equipped I'm not a social, communications expert. So it was kind of just my intuitions about these things. And then the third thing that's really different is just the success of this thing, right? I mean, Goldwater lost in the general election. Buchanan was never really anywhere near to the presidency. So this is really that part is very different. And so my overall take on it in terms of, well, let me say something about the coherence. So basically the continuity question, yes, I agree with you completely. There's all this continuity, and yet it's something different because we're in a different moment and the differences are plain because they're in power now in a way that they haven't been before. In terms of coherence, I am pleased that these divisions continue to rattle the movement, or that they just are starting to. I guess the way I understand it, and I think, Matt, you asked this question too, in a way, how did they start versus how have they finished, or how did, looking at a snapshot of 2016, the MAGA New Right, such as it was, versus now. And Libby, your question about how did this happen in academia? It's kind of connected to that. My little view of the history here is that in 2016, it was basically nothing fringe. Then there were very few intellectuals willing to put their name on these ideas, partly because of those old guardrails. And then they were doing it pseudonymously, right? Nobody would, they were sort of signing statements occasionally saying maybe you could vote for Trump, but it was pretty limited and not many mainstream people, not many recognizable names on those lists. And then he won, and I think, nature abhors a vacuum, and they swooped in. There were all kinds of intellectuals ready to fill that space, right? And I think that's actually not the worst thing. I mean, I don't agree with what they were arguing for the most part, but that's just part of politics. You're going to have radicals on the left, you're going to have radicals in the academy, and they're always going to be more radical than the people running the show, and that's good. I mean, that's one thing I wouldn't want my book to do, would be to shut down radicalism in academia, right? I think that, including on the right, I mean, it's not, there's a guy named Bronze Age Pervert who has a PhD from Yale, and I think it's probably reads to, if, I mean, I tried to be pretty careful there, but I don't want people to not give PhDs to young people who are making arguments that they disagree with. Maybe in that case, it was a bit of a question, but generally speaking, I mean, that's part of what we're doing. We're asking radical questions, right? We're thinking deeply about what the state is, but that means that there are always going to be some people there, if something, you know, if someone gets elected, who are going to come in and start defending it, and that's just unavoidable, I think. But that means, so the story I tell in the book is kind of a decline of just, or a constant radicalization. I think across all the different camps, you see a change. You see Patrick Deneen radicalize in key moments. You see Yoram Hazony make arguments in response to what's happening on the left, especially in their minds. They think that the left, that there was a cultural revolution after the George Floyd protests, which they call riots, that there was a total takeover of the country, and that the response, therefore, had to be a counter-revolution. I think that's a very foolish way of understanding 2020, but that's how they told the story. And so there was they used that to justify their radicalization. You see the same thing with the Claremont people, who started off with already very radical Flight 93, and then it became Caesarism, January 6th. It sort of seems to never end. But now, and that was exacerbated during the Biden administration, the extremism and the just continued to grow, I think. And then I think that's kind of what they needed to get through the January 6th moment. They kind of, they weren't going to step back away. And so now that they're back in power, you start to see things get complicated again. But they've achieved a lot. They've done an enormous amount of destruction, right? And so, and you have somebody like Patrick Deneen, who isn't especially beholden to donors, arguing that in the early days that MAGA, there was no tension between MAGA and Doge. This is a conservative Catholic who says he sees no problem with Elon Musk's whole approach. I mean, I think that's, you know, astonishing. And so the idea that they can all get on board when the pedal hits the metal of politics or whatever, I think is astonishing. I don't see I haven't seen until now a whole bunch of the tensions, right? But now we're seeing it. We're seeing this big blow up at the Heritage Foundation. The donors are angry. They're angry about Israel. They're angry. That's the main thing that has caused this, is the anti-Semitism and the refusal to condemn Fuentes, who is a gross anti-Semite and racist, and it's really unbelievable that he's been in these situations. So I think that question of anti-Semitism is the sincere cleavage, and there are many people I'm surprised to see condemning Carlson and Fuentes. But on the other hand, there's still a lot of that is kind of, there are sincere divisions, right, about foreign policy, sincere disagreements about foreign policy in this movement. I don't know how much that matters. There are, I think, real disagreements about economics, and some of them are still quite sort of, they still talk about free market economics. The donors still think of themselves, I think, on the right as free marketers in many instances. So those things are not settled. But I don't know how much that matters to real politics, and I just don't know the answer to that, obviously. But I still think that, I guess my point on this is, I still think there's all of the, I'm glad to see the disagreements, but it's still giving cover to terrible things that there's still plenty of agreement about, right? The just everything that's happening, ICE, the misogyny, the racism that's embedded in Trump's sort of whole mode. I just find it's nice that they're having some disagreements about really vicious anti-Semitism in their ranks, but it's still just so gross that they've allowed it to get so far, is my personal view of that. All right, what were some of our other questions here? That was Tim.
You're also welcome to open it up.
Yeah.
And
Let me see if I had any other things I just wanted to say. I think, Libby, I do agree with your basic analysis of sort of what's driving the anger. My little formula, which I'll try out because I haven't said this yet, is just it's like the loss of status, and the people who made that happen is what they're angry about. And women have become a real placeholder for that. There are, I could talk more about why they're all men and my cast of characters, and why I think the misogyny matters, but it's the women have become this placeholder for what, and that's sort of there even in more mainstream locations right now. The last week, the division on the right, you might have seen the Ross Douthat interview with Helen Andrews and Leah Sargent, I think her name is, and talking about the feminization of the workplace. Did women in the workplace ruin America, or something like that? So that's just mainstreaming Bapism, basically, which is Bronze Age pervert who is just viciously misogynist, has these different catchphrases for what that means. And it's very funny, I think. I mean, you can read it and laugh, but it's really ugly stuff, just talking about how having women in power and in the bureaucracy and controlling everything has ruined society and female values and all. I mean, it's a whole thing. So, what was I? Yeah. So, what was I talking? Women. Well, no, I did have a point, but I think. So I think the women are the placeholders for the elite. They're all kind of anti-elitists in these obvious ways, but women, the rise of women in the workplace and sort of professional classes has really made them angry. I think that's a big part of it. But it's elites in generally, the professional class, right? Managerial elites is one of their phrases. And I guess in some of that stuff, maybe I don't think any of you asked me about this, but I think a question lurking here is, when do they have a point? What are some of the things that we should be attending to? And I think over the course of the last year, it's watching our politics unfold. I could see how I have a colleague who says, I still can't believe that that they would vote for Donald Trump after everything that's happened. And honestly, by the time this last election happened, I thought, oh, I get it. Like I get the disgust with the elites, the contempt for the Democratic Party. And I'm not a Bernie bro, never have been really, but I get it now. Just the kind of stagnation, the failure to take the economics situation of many people very seriously. And so I think I get it now a little better after having written this book and watching our politics unfold. And one thing we haven't talked about, which is the problem of the manosphere, or the young men, and getting so caught up in this stuff. I think what they're doing is exploiting a real vulnerability of liberalism, right? And that's part of what the book's about too, which is liberalism doesn't teach us how to live, refuses to give us guidance for a comprehensive way of life. And I think that's right and good. But they're really using that sort of moral ambiguity or vacuum or just confusion that's at the heart of liberal democracy, and they're really running with it. And they're saying, we've got some answers for you. Here they are. Some of them are really gross and ugly, but I think that liberals and conservatives need to have some sort of response to that. So I think that's, I'll stop there.
Okay, perfect. So we have maybe 20 or 25 minutes. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. Also, for the other panelists, if you want to sneak in responses to Laura as other people are asking you questions, that's fine. I just want to say very quickly, out of respect to everyone, do please be concise in your questions, because we have a lot of people here and many of them probably want to ask questions. If there's people on this side of the room, I may start and work this way. So I'll take Hillary, and is there anyone in the middle? Okay, and then I'll go to you, and then I'll go to you.
Great. This was terrific. It resonates a lot with an article that was in the Washington Post last week about Buskirk and that Rockbridge attempt to looking forward for what will be the future of the MAGA movement. And I wonder, it looks like you've seen it. So I was wondering what you thought of these tech guys saying there should be an aristocracy in America. And I also wanted, because we're at Elliott, to know what you think about the rise of the right, not just here in the United States and its origins in American, whatever you want to call it, right-wing thought. But I mean, of course, it's very important in France and in Germany and other countries, the Netherlands and so on.
So my question is, how do the academic elements of the new right interact with the perceived bias of, or the perceived like liberal bias that's common to conservative Americans? Like, how do they navigate the fact that most conservative Americans reject academia and have like a disdain for them?
My question is, what role do conspiracy theories and distracts of institute play in the movement, according to the book? What roles do conspiracy theories and distracts of institutes play in the movement, according to the book?
Just thank you. Got it. All right. So I'll go backwards. So that I think the conspiracy theories are really important in the book, but it's only because, well, not only because I think it's mainly on sort of these academic worlds that kind of avoid overt conspiracism like QAnon, right? But the distrust in the institutions is massively important to them because they've got different ways of describing the dominant institutions. So it might be the cathedral you might have heard of, or liberalocracy, managerial elite, the longhouse, all of these different phrases that the different cohorts will use. And they totally distrust those institutions, and they kind of want to destroy them and then rebuild them is the basic take. But the conspiracism also comes in because a lot of it veers into a kind of conspiracism. And so throughout the book, and I would define conspiracism as when you're overstating the kind of nefarious intentions and coordination of the people with power, right? So it's not that there aren't sort of people acting together to do things across our society, but it's when you're sort of exaggerating the power and cohesion of, like, if I were sitting here saying that these guys are all completely coordinated and on the same page and that they control our institutions, that they're in complete control of everything, I think that would be conspiracism. But they do say that about the left, right? And about Jewish people, right? It's the worst instances. And so that's a kind of conspiracism when you're absolutely overstating the amount of coordination and power. And so that mode of thinking, I think, is very important and is sort of pervasive in the movement. And I try to track some of that. And but I think it's also it's hard to, like, we all are like that. Everybody does that. It's hard to escape a kind of conspiratorial mode of thinking, but you kind of have to actively counter it. But it's everywhere. But it's got a different flavor from like QAnon. So it's important in the book. The liberal bias question, I mean, they don't see them, there's a kind of hypocrisy, right? Where they know that they are academics in the academy, many of them, and that they have all these criticisms of the academy and of power, even though they also are that. And so they don't let it bother them too much. And then secondly, they actively pursue an agenda to transform the academy, right? Some of this is very explicit. You've seen it happen in Florida, the new college thing, but also all across the country. They're trying to build new institutions, both within, there are already parallel institutions all across the country where there are sort of conservative programs in place, but they're trying to build new civics institutions across the country and sort of to transform the universities from within now. And some of those are well-meaning and maybe important things. I'm not opposed to all of that. But they have a strong critique of the universities, and they are trying to transform them. I mean, you see all the attacks on higher ed. So I think that's an important piece of it. A lot of that is tied to or modeled after Viktor Orban in Hungary. So coming to your question about the international dimensions of this, I again, it's so fascinating. They are organized. There's sort of nationalist, international. They host conferences with one another. They take ideas from one another. They are coordinated in different ways, but it's not all perfectly coordinated. I mean, it's not a conspiracy. It's just, there is this kind of organizing. And there are massive tensions between still the different countries and interests, and it gets very incoherent and confusing. So it comes up in the book. Mostly Viktor Orban is important in my book because the intellectuals are coordinating specifically with people there. And there's kind of a very direct interaction that continues to happen with Viktor Orban. But they're inspired by people in other countries as well. And the Buzzkirk thing, yes, it's one of those things where I didn't know that was going on. I wish I had known all about that, but Buzzkirk is part of this Claremont group and has been, and so it's sort of touched on, but not. I didn't quite know that face of it. So it's very interesting though. It's a great piece of journalism.
Do the other panelists want to address any of that, or should we take 3 more? Okay. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna go to the center, and then we'll work back. Yeah, that's fine.
Hi. Early on in your book, you identified the new right as right-wing populist, and I agree. Up there with you is Tim Shenk. He wrote a book, Realigners. Is it appropriate to say that the Republican Party has realigned from conservatism to right-wing populism?
Thank you.
To what extent has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the rise of the far right?
Is there anyone on this side of the room? Okay, maybe that, Eric.
Yeah, I'm just sort of curious about the singularity to Trump and all of this, and I'm kind of speaking specifically about sort of the on-off flirtation. You see it, openly espoused by Steve Bannon, but the stuff with, the third term, which again Trump is sort of saying maybe I will, maybe I won't. Now it is still a ways away from the 2020 election, but how do the theorists see, if they're even thinking about a post-Trump era where Steve Bannon just wants it to go on for as long as Trump is alive? So the third term talk, how singular and how important is Trump to all of it?
Great. So I'm going to kick the one question to Tim about the realignment, but let me just say, I think that there's the singularity of Trump is really important, obviously, and they I think are pretty clearly aligned behind Vance. I would be surprised if they threw him under the bus anytime soon, and I think that they would be pleased if Trump were to leave the scene. So maybe there's a tension there between the new right and Bannon. That's what I think of. I think they are very much aligned with. They really love Vance. They don't say a critical word about him. They're very excited about JD Vance, which I think will be a problem for the Republicans because I don't think the people feel that way. But I don't know. It's hard to say. Maybe he can
not be as popular as Trump.
Maybe not as strong. Yeah, they better be careful. But that does come to this question of kind of COVID even and contingency, right? That's another C you should add to your list, I think, because so much of this from the beginning has just been sort of history unfolding in these amazing ways. And COVID was one of those things, right? Where it suddenly all sorts of things were newly possible and very disturbing in the world we were living in. And so I think it was really important. But so is so is JD Vance, so is the fact that he won the first election, so is the fact that the Republican mainstream didn't push back against him during the primaries, as far as I recall, right? But we keep forgetting that. There wasn't really any pushback against him because people weren't taking him seriously. So I think COVID mattered a lot. I think that gives me a great deal of hope, perversely maybe, but I don't think that any of this is set. I don't think Vance is gonna rise and take the baton and have an enormous, I mean, it's all very contingent. I think history's, it's very uncertain what will happen from day to day. And so we can take hope in that. It means there's also lots of possibilities there for, the Bernie bros and the different parts of whatever coalition is hopefully forming on the left to continue to counter some of this. So yeah, I want to punt on the realignment question, just because I think you'll have perhaps a better answer.
Yeah, I think about it all the damn time.
Right.
So I would just say briefly that 1969, Kevin Phillips has a book come out. It's called The Emerging Republican Majority. And according to Phillips, Republicans had the makings of a realignment within their grasp if they could just give this emerging Republican majority what it wanted, which was basically a culturally conservative New Deal. And one version of American history over the last 60 odd years is the refusal of Republicans to make realignment by giving those voters exactly that. The insistence on bringing back some kind of libertarian, small government, laissez-faire, call it what you will. The refusal to couple a culturally conservative social program with some type of significant commitment to the welfare state might be the single biggest obstacle for bringing about that Kevin Phillips vision. We saw it in the Reagan years, and including in the first version of his administration, where a guy gets elected on repudiation of conservative establishment. What is his landmark piece of domestic legislation? Paul Ryan's tax cut. And the question facing Republicans now, I think it's twofold. It's not just can they deliver on that fusion of cultural conservatism and some type of support of a conservative version of social democracy, but also more concretely, can they deliver a realistic solution to the crisis of affordability? And what we saw in 2024 was that frustration with Biden supercharged this long rolling class de-alignment, where going back to around the 1960s, white working class voters increasingly supported Republicans. What happened in 2024? Those numbers ratcheted upward, not just with white working class voters, but with especially Hispanic and to a lesser degree, Black and Asian American working class voters. But it's important to disentangle there. There were two things that were happening in 2024. One was a kind of realignment where, for instance, Hispanics who identified as conservative just started voting for Republicans more than they did before. That was part of the story. But the other part of the story was just, again, a lot of working class people who were pissed off that grocery prices were too high and Donald Trump was running as like president of the grocery store. And what we saw last week, for instance, in the elections was a massive reversal of those Republican gains with Hispanic voters. So I think that as long as you have one, the continuing refusal of the Republican establishment to get on board with a political project that Kevin Phillips saw the outlines of 6 years ago, it just seems to me like if there is a model for Republican realignment, it would probably be that. And failing to deliver it, and it might not work, but that's their best bet. Failing to deliver it is necessarily going to make that project more tenuous. And it's going to be even more difficult if they refuse to deliver on the quality of life, cost of living issues that at least Trump 1.0 was able to deliver in terms of rising macroeconomic growth and a sense that the economy as a whole was pretty good.
And let me just add, there a couple of the people I write about have been, until Trump won again, they were extremely honest about this problem in the party, right? They said that, like Gladden Papman and Sohrab Ahmari both have written pieces that basically say we were delusional to think that the Republican Party would ever be truly populist economically. So I don't think there's any real evidence that that's not true.
On the other hand, the great hope they have is the fecklessness of the Democratic Party, but that's a
And just like COVID, I mean, if Trump had won in 2020, as opposed to lost in large part maybe because of COVID, I don't know, maybe this book would have turned out differently. I mean, it just talked about contingency.
Yeah.
Had he won and been stuck with inflation and all the other things that likely would have happened, I think we'd be having a very different conversation. I don't know what it would be, but and the movement I think would look probably pretty different.
The breaking of MAGA, right?
Yeah, we might be having that conversation.
Yeah.
Are there any on this side again? I think I saw some.
Even if MAGA falls out of wide political and societal power, do you believe as a society we should keep the MAGA ideology relevant as a legitimate ideology?
This is more in response to an issue Professor Anker brought up. So she discussed, the misogyny across every corner of the new right, and specifically the celebration of misogynistic violence against women. And I believe it also got brought up the idea that, women's values are the reason we have so many social issues, and et cetera. What I was wondering is how do high-ranking political figures like Caroline Leavitt or like Kristi Noem play into this? Like, how can they hold their positions of power in a system that's very specifically infused with misogyny.
So the new right you identify includes both like Ivy League theorists and everyman type online instigators. And there's definitely a gap between elite intellectualism and like a populist rage. And I guess I'm wondering how they're able to work together so well, or if this is just another one of those fragments in the movement.
Those are good questions. I think there are pieces and strands of the MAGA ideology that are certainly worth taking seriously. I mean, that was a big impetus for the book, to just try to give voice to some of that. And at least understand the vulnerabilities that they were exploiting, and to get a clearer understanding of that, just as a matter of partly of political philosophy, but also just historically. So I think partly that just has to do with liberalism and the kind of abstract question of how we deal with the problem of meaning in modernity and in our lives and in our communities, which liberals aren't very explicit about or very good at talking about, or even, and certainly not very good at leveraging in our politics. So that's important, but also then economic populism is important, to me at least. And and they've shown how many weird new things are possible in politics, even if we're really discouraged and disagree with them. So I think that those things matter, and they're going to continue to matter. I don't have any affinity for a lot of the way they talk, and even though I take their ideas seriously, I think a lot of them are really bad ideas. But yeah, so some of that we certainly need to take it seriously and think it through. Do you want to speak to the question of the women in the movement, or what do I have to say? I mean, misogyny is a big theme in the book, and I do think it's sort of rampant, especially in the sort of underbellies, and then that kind of trickles up in ways you hear J.D. Vance talking about the childless cat women, and just constantly there's this mockery. And so I didn't spend a ton of time in the really nasty parts of this. I spent enough, right, to get a sense of it. And so I don't want to overstate the extent to which it's just pervasive. Of course, there are a lot of women who are really important to the MAGA movement, who are respected in different parts of the movement, including in the administration itself. And what they are generally embracing, I would say, is a very traditional feminized mode of being a woman, right? So there's the kind of MAGA look. There's a kind of that's obviously part of what's going on, is a kind of appeal to that hyper feminized aesthetic. And I think it's important, though, also to note that in the intellectual world where I am sort of situated and thinking about, there's an important distinction between sort of anti-feminism, which I think has been pervasive in the right for a long time, and then the misogyny, which is a much more sort of explicit effort to bring women down, and just a pervasive sense that women are not equipped intellectually to manage in politics and in public life more generally. And so that's something I think that's quite different. There's no Phyllis Schlafly who's in the current movement. There's no real equivalent to that. And then it's also like a theorized misogyny and contempt for women that's pretty pervasive in some of the people I write about. But they're still important, right? And there are women certainly in the movement, but that's how I see it figuring out. Libby, do you have anything to add? Because I know you've thought a lot more about gender than I have. I mean, it was I come from these weird conservative circles where I didn't have to think about it until I was quite a bit older and had kids and have my own reasons for my feminism, but it wasn't sort of academic.
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with everything that you're saying. And I do think when we think about some of the women who are in these key positions, right? So on the one hand, they are performing a kind of feminization. I mean, they've all had extensive plastic surgery and have like literally contorted their bodies and performances just to be able to look in a particular way, to be able to have the voice to speak in their ways. The other thing that's also particular to people like Levitt and Kristi Noem is like actually within MAGA, Noem is understood to be a kind of puppet figure for Stephen Miller and Corey Lewandowski.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's kind of performing something, but within it, her role is understood to actually be performing something at the service of the men who actually are
Right.
controlling what's really happening and what's going on the ground. Right. And even people who are working for her know, like, that she is like the face that goes on Fox News, but she's not actually involved in coordinating or doing any of the actual work that is behind the huge DHS push and things like that.
I didn't know that.
So I think that, that's where I would read some of that work. And they also are not really claiming to do it within a feminist ethos either. And I'll just say one other thing about thinking about the fractures of the movement that people have been talking about. A few months ago, I was chatting with a political commentator who is deeply embedded in studying the far right, and her prediction was that whenever Trump becomes incapacitated or dies, right, that the movement is really going to fracture, and the two leading voices are going to be J.D. Vance on one side with his financial backer, Peter Thiel. And on the other side, it's going to be Tucker Carlson with his financial backer, Elon Musk. And so when we actually, I mean, as you noted, in thinking about why he might have been platforming the Nazi that last weekend, part of it might be his attempt to, what are the forces that I am going to coalesce around my argument for how to retake the party? And this person speculated that actually, because Tucker Carlson is actually significantly more charismatic and actually willing to go even deeper into the muck, that Carlson will win out.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Right.
Can I just follow up really quick and ask you, so, I mean, there are PhDs, right, who are intellectuals in the academy. You have women who are, high profile in the administration. Trump's own family, right, is Jewish, his Jewish grandkids. I mean, there are a lot of complexities and contradictions within the MAGA movement. I mean, I think it's very hard to kind of shoehorn it. And, some individuals justify it, I think, by saying, I subscribe to, let's say, 80 or 90% of the MAGA agenda, even if they traffic with anti-Semites like Paul Ingrassia. And I think that's another dynamic that's made them successful.
The willingness to go along with all these contradictions and to not test each other's.
And to buy into, larger ideas of the MAGA movement and say, I'm going to take 80% that is good and, maybe close my eyes to the stuff that contradicts who I am.
Yeah, there's a pragmatism to it, right?
And I was just going to say, and the thing is, of course, that you start off saying like, oh, I'll agree with the 80%. Then time goes on. It's like, the 85%, the 90%. Then the election was stolen on January 6th.
Like, this is good.
Yeah.
Laura, any final thoughts?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all for this lovely attendance. Please buy the book. If you are a student, you don't have to buy the book. You can politely line up over here where Laura will go. And we just want to thank you all. The recording will be on our YouTube page if you want to watch it again. So please give a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you.